Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you again for coming to the Albright Institute. Fair warning, we are live on our Albright Live YouTube channel, so as usual, nobody should say or do anything weird while the film is rolling. Just a couple of brief announcements for you. I'm very happy to announce that the Albright was just awarded an NEH fellowship, a grant from the NEH for a fellowship program at the Independent Research Institute's grant. This will supply funding for the Albright through 2021. And of course, for those of you who know, this funds generally 2 or 3 of our significant fellowships every year. So we're very happy about that. In fact, my next announcement is about one of our NEH fellows, Ben Delinka, who will be delivering his workshop next Thursday, April 27th. He'll be discussing international trade and local production during the Middle Islamic period. So we're looking forward to seeing you all next week as well. Without further ado, I would like to invite our Gittin Distinguished Professor, Gary Knoppers, to introduce the speaker.
Thank you. I would like to introduce in turn our distinguished speakers today. David Vanderhooft from Boston College.
Stand over here if you're on the TV.
Sorry. Excuse me. It's my pleasure to introduce David Vanderhooft from Boston College, an internationally renowned expert in Northwest Semitic epigraphy, ancient Near Eastern history, Israelite history, and biblical prophecy. David is currently the Associate Professor of Hebrew Bible in the Department of Theology at Boston College, and I believe you're a visiting professor at the University of Tel Aviv this semester. He's written 2 books I want to call attention to among his many publications. The first is entitled The Neo-Babylonian Empire and Babylon in the Later Prophets. And the second is a more recent book co-authored with Odo Lipschitz on the Yehud stamp impressions, which received the George Ernest Wright Prize from the American Schools of Oriental Research in 2012. He's also the co-editor with Avi Vinitzer and a fellowship for Peter Machina's Literature as Politics, Politics as Literature, and the author or co-author of about 35 articles and book chapters. David is also working on a commentary for Hermeneia on Habakkuk, and we're looking forward to that important study. So without further ado, I'll invite David to speak. His title today is Nebuchadnezzar, King of Babylon, My Servant, Opposing Prophetic Images of the Great King. David? Test.
Very good. Thank you very much to you, Gary, for that nice introduction, and thank you, Matt, and Margaret, for hosting us here at the Albright, and to Shannon for joining me on this overseas journey to Israel this semester, and to all the colleagues and friends who've come today to hear. I very much appreciate it. The figure of Nebuchadnezzar looms larger in the Hebrew Bible than any other foreign ruler. Judean prophetic texts, especially Jeremiah, concur in having Nebuchadnezzar function as the agent of God's sovereignty in the political realm. Now, I should add too that in the Babylonian side, they likewise concur that Nebuchadnezzar was the designated ruler but designated, of course, by Marduk, not the God of Israel. But below the general level of concurrence in the Israelite prophetic texts about his status as an agent lie distinctive perspectives that I think clash. What we especially see in Judean prophecy and in the associated historiography of kings is an effort to understand Nebuchadnezzar within a coherent intellectual framework. In the end, I will argue, however, that the prophetic texts and related historiography cannot fully accomplish this aim. Internal diversity of opinion about Nebuchadnezzar wins out over consistency. But with this acceptance of diversity, the prophetic texts establish something of a framework, a kind of continuum of intellectual options within which ideas about God's mastery of the human political domain can be articulated, but also challenged. The Bible's prophetic repository, then, serves during its formulation and then afterwards as a kind of resource to inform actual political decisions, but also to inform intellectual reflection about politics and its relationship to the divine sphere. But before I turn to the prophetic texts of the Hebrew Bible, I would like to begin with a discussion of several Babylonian inscriptions and other Babylonian realia that treat Nebuchadnezzar's identity. And also offer a projection. They offer, on the one hand, an internal conversation about Nebuchadnezzar's identity, and also a projection, an outward-looking, if you wish, propagandistic image for his rule. Here, as Mario Liverani argued in his seminal study called Prestige and Interest, kings and their scribal elites crafted their royal images with great care. These images, verbal, visual, and concrete, communicated significant political information to internal audiences as well as to external ones, human and divine. Both of these vectors, internal and external, can help us, I think, understand the prophetic reception on the other side of the depiction of Nebuchadnezzar. So I begin first with a discussion of several Babylonian inscriptions that treat Nebuchadnezzar's reconstruction of the two main ziggurats of Babylonia, the Etemenanki ziggurat in Babylon and the Eur-Me-Imenanki, I'm going to ask you to pronounce that later on, Eur-Me-Imenanki of Borsippa. And the reason I'm going to talk about these two texts, I should be perfectly clear about, is because I've been working on them for a while, and I just thought it was cool, that they're cool texts, and they should be discussed. And I'm trying to help a colleague in Barcelona, Rocío da Riva, whose work I'll cite later, and also Michael Herrlis in Munich, to produce an edition of all of the cylinder inscriptions of the ziggurat towers. For each of the two ziggurats, Nebuchadnezzar's Babylonian scribes produced a typical Babylonian inscription celebrating the king's building achievements. We have 13 examples, some of them fragmentary, as this one, of the Etemenanki cylinder, the inscription from Babylon. You can see this example, long known, already since 1890 in the Harvard Semitic Museum, but never published. For the Borsippa Eur-Me-Imenanki ziggurat, we have two types of cylinder inscriptions. A briefer one that's only about 57 lines, known from 4 exemplars, and a longer one, known from 7 exemplars, which is almost entirely a replication or reproduction of the Babylonian Etemenanki inscription. So the two ziggurat inscriptions are closely related, one to the other, and the Borsippa is derivative. Now, Neo-Babylonian royal cylinder inscriptions have very characteristic form and content, which Paul Richard Berger already studied and analyzed in 1973, among others, and then his work was systematically updated more recently by Rocío da Riva in her 2008 book on the Neo-Babylonian royal inscriptions. I won't go into the details of all the form and content of these texts, just to say that they're quite well studied, quite well known on the whole. The longer ziggurat cylinder inscriptions from Babylon and then Borsippa occupy about 170 lines each. As I say, they haven't yet been carefully published in a complete edition. The Etemenanki inscription is written, this one here, in archaizing old Babylonian signs, characteristic of the era of Hammurabi some 1,000 years earlier. The Borsippa inscription is known from 4 exemplars, using 4 of them using Old Babylonian signs, and 3 using contemporary Neo-Babylonian signs. It wasn't uncommon for them to have an edition of each kind of writing. The Amenanke inscription was written first, as I say, and then used as the template for the Borsippa text, which reproduces most of its content verbatim. The structure of the text is has been summarized in a chart by Andrew George. This is the Google Earth images of the actual remains on the left of the ziggurat in Babylon, which had been robbed out mostly by its bricks taken for building in contemporary periods. But here's the structure of a typical of the cylinder inscription of Nebuchadnezzar. And you can see it's got things that are typical if you know Neo-Babylonian inscriptions, the self-presentation of the king with lots of flowing rhetoric about who he is. He's the great king, the wonderful king, the pious king, and so on and so forth. Temporal clause then referring to the king's selection by Marduk, the god of Babylon, his pious behavior in response to that selection, and then his undertaking to complete work on the ziggurat, which was begun by his father, Nabopolassar. The next section, which you can see from the line numbers is the longest by far, is this mobilization of the whole world as a source of labor. And we're going to come back to this piece of the inscription a little bit later on. But it's obviously quite important to the structure and intent of this entire inscription. Finally, a celebration of the completion of the work and prayers requesting blessings. They're nice because also the Nebuchadnezzar asks that Amenanke itself pray for him, which is I always like that the ziggurat does the praying. Now, I'm primarily interested today in two things about the Babylon and Borsippa texts. One, there's a key difference between the two of them, the ones from Babylon and Borsippa, which communicates political and theological information to a learned internal scribal audience. Okay? We'll talk about that very briefly. And then second, I'm interested in this list of tributary nations in the text, which justifies the outward-looking projection of Babylonian royal power to the wider world. Now, as I say, the Borsippa text copies its content from the Babylon one, including statements that Nebuchadnezzar had undertaken to complete the construction of Babylon's Amenanke at the command of Marduk. So Borsippa even celebrates that he built the Babylon tower. So the Borsippa text embeds the Babylonian Amenanke inscription within it, and mention of that ziggurat, whereas not the case for the other way around. The text also asserts that Nebuchadnezzar undertook construction on the Borsippa ziggurat at the behest of Marduk, but in the fourth part of the inscription from Borsippa, the scribes make a small but clear addition to their template, the Babylonian exemplar, which reflects their Borsippa context. And no one had seen this before until we started to put all the different texts together and produce two continuous examples of each text. Now, and it's important to remember that Borsippa was the principal cult city not of the state deity Marduk, but of his son and heir, Nabu. But Marduk clearly was Nebuchadnezzar's preeminent divine patron. So it's Marduk who appoints him, and so on and so forth. Okay? So the Borsippa scribes, in the fourth section of their inscription, insert a short paragraph spliced between two parts of the Babylonian text in a note that reads as follows. It may seem obscure to you, but here's Nebuchadnezzar. The sanctuaries of the great gods I made shine like the day. In Babylon, now not Borsippa, the text is for Borsippa. In Babylon, for Nabu, the lofty minister, perfect youth, powerful, foremost god, preeminent of the goddess Tsarpanitum, who's Marduk's wife, guardian of the totality of heaven and earth, who within Esagil is surpassing, whose decrees cannot be rivaled. Great Lord, my Lord, I gave reverent attention. Okay? It's all flowery. They love to be very flowery in their language. What's going on here is that the Borsippa account includes a short paragraph spliced right into it, arguing that Nabu, the offspring of Marduk and his wife, was specifically worshipped in the Esagil temple of Marduk in Babylon. Not the ziggurat, but the Esagil temple, which is the main state temple in Babylon. Right? There's nothing particularly unusual about Nebuchadnezzar pairing Marduk and Nabu and treating them as his patrons and so forth in his inscriptions. But in this small little paragraph, we have a clear case of scribal learning and compositional creativity that allows the Nabu devotees of Borsippa to highlight their god's centrality within the main national temple, whether for purely theological reasons or perhaps to secure certain additional prerogatives. The modification of the Tamanaki inscription template, then, patently reflects an internal scribal discourse and probably competing scribal claims. The point seems to be to argue that Nebuchadnezzar, the great king, is equally solicitous of both the national patron deity Marduk and his son and heir Nabu. So something's at stake. And wouldn't it be nice if in biblical texts we had two exemplars and we could see that someone stuck the paragraph right in the middle of one of them, so we knew exactly when the texts were edited and by whom. We don't quite get that luxury in the Bible. If this is an example of textual composition, though, designed very much for an internal and learned Babylonian audience and for consumption, the ziggurat texts and also the related stone stele depicting Nebuchadnezzar as the architect of the ziggurats, which was published by Andrew George, this is it, also have an outward-looking prestige aspect, an outward-facing claim about imperial hegemony. So there's an additional component, if you wish, in the communicative strategy. In the Tamanaki, and this is not one of these cylinder inscriptions, it didn't belong to either Borsippa or Babylon. It's a separate kind of text, a stone stele, very unusual. It's in the possession of Martin Scoyen in private hands. In any case, in the Tamanaki cylinder, Nebuchadnezzar is said to put the tupshiku, or the corvée basket, for doing state labor, on all the far-flung nations at the command of Marduk. And here's just a quick image of a map which locates Babylon at the very center of the world, very famous map from the British Museum on clay. They're not unknown, but the little rectangle right here is the city of Babylon, and the vertical strip is the Euphrates River running through the city. Sorry, I got to my text. I got it in the wrong order. So Marduk then gives all of the nations to Nebuchadnezzar so he can put the work basket on them. All the widespread peoples, the governance of whom I exercise at the command of Marduk, my lord, and who carried mighty cedars from the mountain of Lebanon to Babylon, my city, all the widespread peoples, all the peoples of the wide inhabited regions, whom Marduk my lord bestowed upon me, I subjected them to corvée, to build a temenanki, and I imposed the tupshiku upon them. The temenanki inscription, uniquely among Nebuchadnezzar's many inscriptions, gives then a detailed enumeration of those peoples and regions. It moves, and I won't give you a list and the map, from southern Babylonia and the Gulf region, all the way up the Tigris and Euphrates valleys, naming locations, and going all the way to the western shores of the Mediterranean, sort of the eastern shore of the Mediterranean Sea, the so-called Upper Sea in their imagination. Now, the Borsippa text, the Urme Imananki inscription, simply copies this entire list from the Babylonian example verbatim, with just a few orthographic variants. Meanwhile, the stele, to go back to that one, the stone inscription, for want of space, since it's more restricted in how much text it can hold, has a simple formulaic assertion about this imperial hegemony, but no detailed list of all the peoples. It says instead, in order to complete a Temenanki and a Urme Imananki to the top, both of them, I mobilized all countries and so on and so forth, from the upper sea to the lower sea. So again, it's an explicit imperial claim about universal geographic hegemony, but the point is that they're for building the ziggurats. Right? That's why he has this hegemony. So it's clear from all of the ziggurat inscriptions, including the stone one, but especially the cylinders that enumerate all the peoples, that Marduk legitimated Nebuchadnezzar's rule over the kings and rulers of the earth for the purpose of building the two ziggurats of Babylon and Borsippa. I should note parenthetically that the rather famous narrative in Genesis chapter 11 about the city and tower built in the plain of Shinar inverts this characteristic logic of Nebuchadnezzar's ziggurat inscriptions. In Genesis, the whole earth, kol haaretz, congregates in the plain and deploys baked bricks and bitumen for mortar to construct their city and its tower, v'rosho v'shamayim, with its head in the clouds. But unlike Nebuchadnezzar's gathering of the far-flung peoples into Babylon at the behest of Marduk, in Genesis, Yahweh frustrates the building projects and disperses the peoples throughout the earth. Yahweh, in short, reverses Nebuchadnezzar's claim in the ziggurat texts about assembling peoples for the building project, and instead goes the opposite way. So he may be also said in some sense then to be undermining Marduk's imprimatur for the imperial project. Although others have argued for similar kinds of views of the Genesis 11 narrative, including Christoph Oehlinger, who argued for an Assyrian imperial framework, an earlier time, for the tower story, in his book Weltreich und eine Rede, the association of the tale with Babylon, Bavel at the end of chapter 11, and the unique insistence in the ziggurat inscriptions of Nebuchadnezzar on gathering of all the people of the regions to build makes, I think, a Neo-Babylonian context more plausible for that story, in my judgment. We should also note, however, that the concrete projection of the imperial claims of the ziggurat inscriptions is then literally etched into the very landscape of the Western periphery in the form of rock inscriptions. As Rocio da Riva has brilliantly demonstrated in several studies of Nebuchadnezzar's rock inscriptions in the Lebanon, the king's image was actually carved into several visible but inaccessible rock faces along strategic passes leading from the Bekaa into the Lebanon range. In addition to the lengthy and well-known inscription in the Nahar al-Kalb, which is just north of Beirut on the coast, we now know, thanks to da Riva's work, of 4 other monumental depictions of Nebuchadnezzar in the Lebanon. Some of them were known for a long time, and other of them she has rediscovered recently. Just quickly show them to you. Now, I apologize for the processes of wind and erosion and rain and so forth, but they're not real well preserved. But in the analysis of them, there are several features that are characteristic of Babylonian kings, and da Riva makes a very compelling case that in all instances of these rock inscriptions, we have, in fact, not a different king, but always the same king, Nebuchadnezzar. There's another example that's down in Jordan, which is of Nabonidus, a later Babylonian king, but it has some distinctive elements that help, and text that help prove that. In this case, we have an image of the king felling a cedar tree, and you can see vaguely branches up here of the tree. And ultimately a kind of root. It seems to have been stripped of all of its greenery and whatnot to make it easier to chop it down and float it down the river. And Nebuchadnezzar is chopping it down with his hand. Also at Wadi Brissa, in another example of Nebuchadnezzar's active role in the West, we have him fighting a lion. Here you can only see sort of the 4 paws of the lion here, and its head and mane in this region. You see Nebuchadnezzar's head up here, and his robe down here. Apparently, for the last series of decades, these things have also been used for target practice. So they have been damaged as well by automatic weapon fire. A bit of a shame, but there you are, hunting in another way. In the Shir Sanam location in Lebanon, da Riva discovered a new example, and this is of Nebuchadnezzar again. You can see here he's got his little conical hat And here's his arm and his elbow, so you can see it's relatively clear. His foot coming out of a robe down here, the back of the robe. And this one has a text, so it's somewhat visible to identify him. Another relief from nearby in the Wadi Es-Saba, which is the Wadi of the Lion, and so it's appropriate. He's fighting the royal, and as characteristic of the Mesopotamian royal tradition, a rampant lion. And here you have him in the posture of a worshiper. You can see up above a moon disk here, and then the seven-pointed star over here with another astral symbol in between, and the king standing erect before them in the posture of a worshiper. This one also had a text which helps identify it. So we have here then a very clear projection of Nebuchadnezzar's image in the West. And as Dariva writes, these reliefs were public monuments and visible to all. The pictorial representations functioned as symbols of military and political control. They were messages aimed at the conquered populations of the mountains and at potential enemies, who were a very obvious form of propaganda. We might note, too, that 3 of the 4 of these of the known sites for Nebuchadnezzar's rock inscriptions are in the immediate vicinity of Ribla, which is where the star is over there, just above the Orontes. And both kings, in the Book of Kings and the Book of Jeremiah in the Hebrew Bible, narrate that Nebuzaradan, Nebuchadnezzar's field commander, brought Zedekiah, the last king of Judah, and his sons, as well as numerous Judean elite notables, to the king Nebuchadnezzar, who was stationed at Riblah. Nebuchadnezzar had them put to death there, killing Zedekiah's sons in his sight, after which then the king of Judah was blinded and led away to Babylon. Royal inscriptions and monuments in the immediate vicinity of Nebuchadnezzar's, if you wish, field post for control of the western regions, the eastern littoral of the Mediterranean. To what extent, then, to ask the bigger question, did the external facing portrait of the king, both the logic that's evident in the Atemenanki inscriptions and the actual imagery that we see inscribed on rock faces, for example, how much did these engage the prophetic imagination in the Hebrew Bible? I'd argue, in effect, that the prophetic discourse of the Hebrew Bible must actually accommodate the reverse polarity from that of the Babylonian development of Nebuchadnezzar's image. The basic portrait of Nebuchadnezzar projected outward from Babylon and facing towards Judah is shared by the two in the middle, if you wish. So there's an internal Babylonian discourse, as we saw inside the ziggurat inscriptions, and there's many other kinds of examples of that. And then the outward-facing example. Judah receives, as does other polities, that outward-facing projection, but then there's an internal discourse as well about the king's significance within the political theological worldview of ancient Judah. And this was subject to ongoing consideration and reflection. So let me turn then to the prophetic corpus, where it won't be any surprise to you to learn that the book of Jeremiah dominates the discussion here. In fact, Jeremiah may be fairly said to have a kind of obsession with Babylon. The toponym, the name of the city Bavel, or region, occurs far more in Jeremiah than any other book. In addition, the Masoretic version of the book refers far more frequently to Nebuchadnezzar than any other book of the Bible, with 36 of 80 explicit references to the king's name. By comparison, the much later book of Daniel, in its court tales, accounts for an additional 26 exemplars of the name. So 70, I'm not so good with math, 62 of 80 are in these two books. One could say, therefore, that Jeremiah is the book in which evidence for engagement with the external projection of the Babylonian image of Nebuchadnezzar should most readily be expected. Of course, the empty Masoretic text of Jeremiah is also famous, or notorious, depending on your opinion, since Jeremiah was an advocate of Judean capitulation to the Babylonian power. And he sharply criticized both other prophets and members of the Judean royal court who were not in favor of capitulation. The thrust of Jeremiah's policy program, then, was to ensure continued existence of the kingdom of Judah as a client kingdom of Babylon if necessary, in order to preserve its cultural and religious autonomy. The political factionalism of Judah during the last decades of its existence has already been treated well by others, so I won't go into all the details, but clearly Jeremiah can be seen on the pro-Babylonian side of things. So I'd like to highlight several of the ways in which the several elements that are characteristic of Nebuchadnezzar's external projection that also find an echo in Jeremiah. First, we saw in the ziggurat inscription from Babylon and Borsippa that Nebuchadnezzar's control over all rulers and regions and so forth was understood as a divine mandate bestowed on him by Marduk. Jeremiah concurs that Nebuchadnezzar is the subject of a divine mandate, but naturally insists that it was Yahweh who grants Nebuchadnezzar this prerogative. Famously, in 3 instances in Jeremiah, Yahweh is said to refer to Nebuchadnezzar as my servant, Avdi. Let me review these passages briefly with you. In an oracle attributed to the 4th year of King Jehoiakim of Judah, which was also designated as the first regnal year of Nebuchadnezzar, so 605, 604, we read the following. Now I'll stick with the English on these. And most of my translations you'll see come from the JPS Tanakh translation or some modification of them by me. Assuredly, thus says Yahweh of hosts, because you wouldn't listen to my words, all you Judeans, I'm going to send for all the peoples of the north, the Mishpachot of the north, declares Yahweh, and for Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, my servant, wrong inclusion of Babylon again, by me, and bring them against this land and its inhabitants, and against all the nations round about. I will exterminate them and make them a desolation, an object of hissing, ruins for all time, which is nice for the archaeologists among you. It's ruin, chovot, to excavate. This passage explicitly associates Nebuchadnezzar with all the polities of the north, the Mishpachot Tzafon. And this is significant because in the earliest chapters of Jeremiah, for example in chapters 4 through 6, an anonymous foe from the north, probably Babylon, is alluded to, and the prophet warns will come to devastate Judah. This text also, Jeremiah 25, also claims that Jeremiah had been making such prophecies for 23 years, it goes on to say right after this. The oracle thus functions within the Masoretic text of Jeremiah to place Nebuchadnezzar's imperial rule at the center of Jeremiah's concern. A second instance of the reference to Nebuchadnezzar, my servant, appears in chapter 27. Here, the discourse is placed within a more cosmic framework, which asserts that God, as creator, can dispose of the nations of the earth as he chooses. If it's I who created the earth and humans and beasts who are on the earth, by my great might and my outstretched arm, and I grant it to whomever I deem proper. I herewith grant all these lands to my servant King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. I even give him the wild beasts to serve him. All nations shall serve him, his son and his grandson, until the turn of his own land comes, when many nations and kings will subjugate him in turn. The nation or kingdom that doesn't serve him, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, and doesn't put its neck under the yoke of the king of Babylon, that nation I will visit, declares Yahweh, with sword, famine, and pestilence, until I've destroyed it by his hands. In the third and the last instance of an oracle with the my servant language, it's an oracle associated and an associated ritual action that's allegedly given by Jeremiah in Egypt, where he had been deported later after the demise of Judah. And it's directed against Egypt. Jeremiah delivers a word stating that Nebuchadnezzar will come and sack Egypt. something, by the way, which apparently never happened. He seems to have gotten it wrong. Get yourself large stones, God says to the prophet, and embed them in mortar in the brick structure at the entrance to Pharaoh's palace in Tahpanhes, which is Daphne, and some with Judeans looking on. And then say to them, thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, I am sending for Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, my servant, and I will set his throne over these stones which I have embedded. He'll spread out his pavilion over them. He'll come and attack the land of Egypt, delivering those destined for plague to plague, and so on and so forth. We'll kill them all. Now, in a 2014 article by Klaas Smelik, the Dutch scholar, on Yahweh's use of this epithet, my servant, in Jeremiah, he notes that it must surely be one of the most surprising characterizations in the prophetic literature. God calls Nebuchadnezzar my servant not once but 3 times, as if to emphasize its accuracy. But Nebuchadnezzar, Smelik asks, this is the guy who campaigned repeatedly in the West, captured Jerusalem in 597, and deported its king Jehoiakim, along with the royal family and Judean elites. He's the one who ruled a decade later, sacked Jerusalem, destroyed the temple, and deported a substantial portion of the population to Babylonia. Go see the burnt house. Yahweh calls him my servant. Furthermore, as Smelik rightly notes, the other figures designated as servants, my servant of God in Jeremiah, are 2, Jacob and David, the eponymous ancestor of the people of Israel and Israel's foremost dynastic founder. A rather surprising company to keep if you're Nebuchadnezzar, the destroyer. Konrad Schmidt of Zurich, in a recent paper, has concluded the following about this epithet, my servant, from a slightly different perspective. He writes, the argument involved in this servant terminology applied to Nebuchadnezzar seems to be the following. In Nebuchadnezzar's ascendance to world domination in 605, the kingdom of God's grace passed into Nebuchadnezzar's hands, unquote. Schmidt is particularly interested here in a theological interpretation of the end of the Davidic legitimacy as presented in Jeremiah. But I prefer to understand this triple characterization of Nebuchadnezzar, God's servant, as part of a wider discourse about divine sovereignty and the problem of empire. For Jeremiah, that is the problem of Nebuchadnezzar. Max Weber already outlined, from what I think and use for myself at least, a kind of intellectual framework for this sort of discourse already a century ago. The prophets, he wrote, could not have arisen without the world politics, Weltpolitik, of the great powers who threatened their homeland, and with which the majority of their most impressive oracles deal. Nor, on the other hand, could it have arisen on the soil of these same great powers. Each prophet concerned himself rather overwhelmingly with the destiny and the state of the people. And I think that's a good perspective to approach this question in Jeremiah. But I think we can also move beyond this rather general framework for characterizing Nebuchadnezzar to see additional ways in which concrete facts of reception and contact with the Babylonian persons and ideas appear throughout the book. Let me begin with the very remarkable, if wholly unverifiable, I should say, narrative in Jeremiah 39 and 40, which actually credits Nebuchadnezzar himself with having had a special concern with Jeremiah's well-being after the city falls. First, the background here. Within the tumultuous context of the Judean subservience and resistance to Babylon, Jeremiah is accused several times in the book of not just being a Babylonian toady, but an actual collaborator. Why is he accused of this? Well, first, of course, he announces the demise of Jerusalem and of the kingdom. This is part of his, integral to his prophecy, of course. But in addition, in the letter that Jeremiah is said to have sent, and it's quoted, to the deportees who had already been shipped to Babylon in 597, Jeremiah advises, quote, the priests, prophets, and elders of Judah to tell the deportees in Babylonia to build houses, plant gardens, take wives, have children, etc., in chapter 29. Jeremiah also insists, and this is a kind of wild text, that they are to, the people in Babylonia are to make oracular inquiries to promote the well-being of Babylon, since its prosperity will undergird theirs. Seek out, and I understand this verb here, drash dirshu, to mean make divination inquiries. Seek out the peace of the city where I, Yahweh, have deported you. Make supplication on its behalf to Yahweh, for in its well-being you will have your well-being. The text then goes on to illustrate the fate of two prophets who take non-cooperative stances vis-a-vis Babylon and Babylonian hegemony, unlike Jeremiah. Ahab, the son of Koliah, and Zedekiah, the son of Maaseiah. And what are we told about these two guys? The Babylonian king roasts them in a fire. Resistance is futile, if you wish. With these sorts of behaviors and comments in mind, we can understand why Jeremiah is accused by royal officials of sedition against the Judean crown, and even worse, of defecting to the Chaldean military. It was Israel Fall of the Hebrew University who recognized the significance of a particular idiom that described defection. It appears, first of all, in Jeremiah 21:9, in a general warning to all Judeans. It says, whoever remains in the city will die by the sword, famine, and pestilence. He loves those three. But whoever goes out and defects to the Chaldeans, the Nephal ala Kasdim, who are besieging you, those people will live. Okay? This idiom, as a file notes, describes defection to the Chaldeans, that is, crossing the military fortification line and capitulating to save one's life. So then later in chapter 37, Jeremiah is accused of defecting to the Babylonians. Elakazdim danofel, it says. But Jeremiah repudiates the charge, and he's using the very same language. He says, sheker. He says, bullshit. This is what sheker really, I think, should be translated. He says, I didn't defect. Then, just after Jerusalem is allegedly besieged by Nebuchadnezzar's army, its walls are breached, and Zedekiah, his sons, and members of the elite were sent off to Nebuchadnezzar in Riblah, we learn of Nebuchadnezzar's alleged solicitation for Jeremiah. Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon gave orders to Nebuzaradan, who's the chief of the army, concerning Jeremiah. He's up in Riblah, and he's worried about Jeremiah. He says, take him and look after him. Do no harm, but grant whatever he asks of you. So, that's what Nebuzaradan did. But notice he's lumped together with a bunch of other Babylonian officials here. And their names are all Mesopotamian in this. I'm not going to go through the whole list of them, but it's an interesting list. It appears also in chapter 39, verse 3, just a few verses earlier, and I'll say something about that in a second. They took Jeremiah out and brought him into the care of Gedaliah, the son of Ahikam, son of Shaphan, who is the Babylonian appointee in Judah. Right? So the Babylonians are releasing this guy from prison at Nebuchadnezzar's suggestion and putting him in the hands of the Babylonian lackey. Nebuchadnezzar, my servant, indeed. Surely, right, the reader shouldn't conclude that Jeremiah is a Babylonian quisling who advocated for capitulation and collaboration with the Chaldeans and who defected to their side. No. Right? We shouldn't conclude that. Nebuchadnezzar, God's servant, is simply solicitous of God's true prophet. Right? Well, I suspect that the rhetorical effort of the narrative to prove such an outlandish claim, frankly, is connected to the double enumeration in this chapter, 39, of the list of Nebuchadnezzar's officials. So it appears in chapter 39:3 and in 39:13. And I wonder whether the repetition of this list is designed in part to establish an element of verisimilitude. The writer of chapter 39 knows the configuration of the Babylonian army down to the proper names and titles of its elite officers, some of whom are actually known to us from Babylonian sources. One of the most remarkable discoveries of the last few years was by Michael Jursa of Vienna, who found this tablet in the British Museum, which has a statement on it which tells us that a certain guy made a donation to a temple in Babylon of a certain amount of gold. His name is Nabu-Sharusu-Ukin. And back years ago, before this tablet was known, I suspected that one of the people in the list in Jeremiah should have a name something like this. So when Marissa actually found the guy, who's named in Jeremiah as 39:3 and 13, I have to say I cracked a glass of whatever it was that we cracked that day. Maybe two, I can't remember. But it's a rather remarkable discovery. Given the removal of Zedekiah and his cohort to appear before Nebuchadnezzar in Riblah, and the appearance of Nebuchadnezzar's officials in Jerusalem, the text then furnishes a framework within which it could be reasonable to infer that Nebuchadnezzar actually did give orders to protect Jeremiah's well-being. Of course, we can't know. But my point here today is that the book's identification of Nebuchadnezzar as Yahweh's servant should be considered in connection with the sedition charge against Jeremiah, his overall attitude to the Babylonian hegemony, the accusations against him, and finally Nebuchadnezzar's improbable solicitude for the prophet's well-being. I should add, too, that while my admittedly synchronic treatment of the Masoretic text of Jeremiah offers us something of a bird's eye view, I understand, of the whole matter, subsequent interpreters and translators didn't really rest very easy with this characterization of Nebuchadnezzar as the servant of Yahweh. In all three of the cases that I showed you where he's called my servant by God, and the Septuagint translation fails to include the designation. Although some other options for the interpretations for why that absence exists have been proffered, Gerhard Fischer takes this as an effort to overcome what is a provocative association between Yahweh and Nebuchadnezzar. In other words, for the Septuagint, the interpretive problem of Nebuchadnezzar remained a live one. Now, before I come to a completely contrasting point of view about the Chaldean aggressor, let me just say one quick thing about Ezekiel, Jeremiah's rough contemporary. Ezekiel, in contrast to Jeremiah, situates its protagonist among the deportees in Babylonia. And it obsesses over the inexorable historical logic that resulted in Judah's demise. So it's like Jeremiah in some senses, and which terminated the cultic practice in Jerusalem. That's Ezekiel's main problem. Yet, despite the portrait of the prophet that he's ensconced in Tel Aviv, the site, no animus towards Judah's erstwhile conquerors, the Babylonians, informs Ezekiel's rhetoric. Babylon is simply not the subject of his invective. I've argued elsewhere that linguistic and ideational processes of acculturation that we see in Ezekiel, together with his lack of animosity to Babylon, suggest rather that Judeans among the Golah simply understood that Babylonians were their local benefactors, and it did them no good to attack Nebuchadnezzar. But in my judgment, this is an example of evidence for Babylonians in Judea, Judeans in Babylonia. But in my judgment, the real contrasting prophetic viewpoint about the Chaldeans comes in the little book of Habakkuk, which I argue clearly knows of and recognizes the military accomplishments of Nebuchadnezzar in the West, but arrives at an entirely different judgment about the Chaldean than Jeremiah. This is him. His name might mean cucumber, so I think Donatello possibly got it right. Here. Sort of looks like one. In my judgment, Habakkuk, in my view, attacks the idea that the God of Israel is a just God. It argues that in the face of misery and impending invasion by a foe, God is complicit. And his decision to raise up the Chaldeans is unacceptable. Habakkuk, although thoroughly embedded in the Judean prophetic tradition, and impossibly, as we'll see, directly dependent even on some of Jeremiah's depictions, nevertheless assessed the relationship between politics and cosmology, if you wish, differently from Jeremiah. Around 600 or so, the emergent Neo-Babylonian kingdom alighted in the west and gave Sai Gittin something to excavate and people at Ashkelon something to excavate in 604 and 603, the book of Habakkuk marshaled well-known arguments to contest the venerable principle that Yahweh used Nebuchadnezzar as his agent. Habakkuk, I argue, sought to sever cause, that is to say, the malfeasance of God's people, from presumed effect, that is, the invasion of the land by Nebuchadnezzar. After all, if you just scratch it a little bit, the very old Near Eastern principle that the gods could send a punitive agent gave rise to a rather thorny theoretical problem, which was noted elsewhere, for example, in Isaiah 10, different text. That text in Isaiah 10, which identifies Assyria, the predecessor, as the rod of Yahweh's anger against Judah, articulates the theoretical problem in the form of a rhetorical aphorism. It asks, will the axe elevate itself above the one who wields it? What happens, in short, when God's agent of wrath runs amok? Jeremiah's interpretive option, as I've intimated above, is to absorb Nebuchadnezzar's outward-facing projection and his military accomplishments by labeling the king Yahweh's servant. Habakkuk, by contrast, targets this Jeremianic portrait of Nebuchadnezzar as poppycock. I like that word. In verses 2 to 4 of this book, the prophet opens with a very bitter complaint about his experience and perception of violence, strife, absence of Torah, and the oppression of the innocent by the wicked. The prophet his complaint is directed, though, towards God, who, the prophet says, doesn't offer salvation from violence, and worse, he tolerates wrongdoing. I regard this passage as an accusation against God for his inaction in the face of depredations against Judah from outside. God's astonishing response to this accusation is an inexplicable intensification. He states that he is, against all expectations, raising up the Chaldeans, this military force that represents Babylon. In the artful description of their military might, I think we see both the absorption of Mesopotamian or Babylonian tropes for depicting raging conquerors. Sometimes it's the plural army, and sometimes it's the singular king. But it also seems that clear that Habakkuk is engaged with the language of Jeremiah. Where Jeremiah's warnings of foreign invaders coming against disobedient Judah constitute the core of his message, Habakkuk has the divine voice describe the emergence of Chaldeans as bewildering, as unbelievable. And more obviously, Habakkuk doesn't concede the point that is at the core of Jeremiah's message, namely that the people's behavior has forced God's hand to bring up Nebuchadnezzar, or bring down. Instead, after the fashion of Moses, Habakkuk reminds God of his essential attributes. He tells him in second person address, you are from of old, you are Mekedem, he says. You don't die. You're too pure to look upon evil, and so forth. So then the prophet asks, why do you look at oppressors and remain silent, while the wicked swallows the one more righteous than he? To further this argument, the prophet then makes a very startling rhetorical accusation against God. This is the raising up. This is the one I'm interested in. Habakkuk complains to God in chapter 1, verse 14, V'ta se adam k'dyayam, k'remes lo moshel bo. You've made Adam, humanity, like fish of the sea, like reptiles, with none to rule over him. This, I think, represents a quite clear allusion to the tradition that God created humans in his image with the intent that they exercise dominion over the creatures. In fact, the first 5 words of Habakkuk 1:14 also appear in the same order in Genesis 1:26. Okay, I have that here, so you can see it. Asa, Adam, Gehayam, and Remes, all in the same order. In Genesis, as here, God creates humans, Asa. In Genesis, the intent is that the humans will have dominion over other creatures. In Habakkuk, however, humans come to resemble these creatures. By his allusion then to the Genesis narrative, or the tradition on which it's based, I'm not arguing it's a quotation exactly, Habakkuk effectively describes the devolution of humans in the created order. They are brought down a rung on the evolutionary ladder. The Chaldean conqueror, by denuding nations in the role of God's agent, then becomes a kind of fisherman. And the text describes him that way. A sea monster, or in chapter 2, he's likened to Mavet, to death. But it is, after all, in the nature of monsters to act like monsters. The prophet's real accusation is that God has acted contrary to his nature by appointing the monster. I would argue that here we have a very clear rejection of the logic that appears in Jeremiah's "my servant" passages, especially Jeremiah 27, when God declared, as we saw before, it's I who created Asa, the world, Asiti, and Adam, the beasts who are on the earth, and by my great might and my outstretched arm I grant it to whomever I deem proper, and I herewith grant them to my servant Nebuchadnezzar. Habakkuk, I would argue, rejects exactly the type of conclusion offered by Jeremiah. Moreover, Habakkuk's argument rests on an interpretation of Israelite cosmogonic traditions that should neuter the imperial ravager, who we may note, Habakkuk doesn't even deign to identify by name. God should not, in Habakkuk's judgment, raise up the Chaldeans. Nebuchadnezzar thus looms very large within the prophetic corpus of the Hebrew Bible. The several examples I've cited suggest that the prophets absorb and refract aspects of the outward-facing projection Nebuchadnezzar disseminates, but that they do not finally agree on how to understand him. They must, in various ways, by virtue of their identities, affirm God's sovereignty. But while Jeremiah, perhaps with a vested political interest in the matter, proposes an interpretation that identifies Nebuchadnezzar as God's punitive agent for correction, Habakkuk rejects this logic and seeks a mechanism to rescind God's judgment. The prophetic tradition thereby bequeaths to Judaism, and also to later Christian tradition, several interpretive options for understanding Nebuchadnezzar the Great King. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Take questions, including any that come through online. Adam will raise his hand if he has any there.
I just had a question about actually your last point regarding Habakkuk 1:14 and Genesis 1:26. I mean, in your perspective, do you think the author of Habakkuk knows the text of Genesis and then trying to subvert it? Because from my reading of the text, it seems like in Genesis, there is a ruler of the fish of the sea, which is supposed to be humanity, whereas in Habakkuk, he's said, you're just like these things without a ruler. In some sense, I mean, could you expand on that connection a little bit and how you see that playing out?
I remain agnostic about direct textual connection, one thing to the other. And that's simply because I don't know that the texts, the priestly text of Genesis 1, who knows exactly where to date it? Depending on who you ask, it could be later than the early 6th century, it could be maybe somewhat earlier, it could be substantially later. So I don't want to get in the business of necessarily having to prove the whole case. So what I try to do by way of evading having to make that choice is to say that it's dependent upon the text or the tradition of that the text is based upon. That it knows the same tradition, however, I believe is correct. And that's because of the specific verbal forms. It adjusts. If you notice, you have in Habakkuk, the first word is v'ta'aseh. That shouldn't be that form. In Hebrew, the form should be v'ta'as, the short prefix conjugation verb. And the reason why it's the wrong form is not, I think, an error, although the Qumran text actually corrects it and drops the hey, because it knows the right form is v'ta'as. The point is that it's v'ta'aseh because it mirrors na'aseh in Genesis. We, right? Let us create Adam. And whoever that divine we is in Genesis is familiar to but it's such a prominent tradition that I suspect we shouldn't simply think of it as having been written one time by the priestly writer somewhere X, Y, or Z. It's a tradition that's probably known to P. So I don't want to have to come down on it.
I suppose more of what I was getting at was the traditions behind the text,
Yeah.
so the actual texts. Yeah. So
I don't think P just composed the text like a poet who's struck by inspiration. I think it's an emerging and developing sort of liturgical style text. So that's what I think, and I'm not, of course, alone in thinking that.
Thank you for your lecture, and I really appreciate also the comparison between cuneiform sources and biblical texts. At the beginning, you talked a little bit about the context of the scribes in Babylon. So how would you, if you were asked, sociologically to place, let's say, Jeremiah, and also Ezekiel, is it accidental that they're both cast as priests from families, or how would you sort of order, of course, within Judah?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and it's a huge topic of conversation. It's been treated, of course, by many scholars on the individual prophets, but also comparatively, for example, by Bob Wilson of Yale University, who has a very nice book, Prophecy and Society, which looks at the social location of prophets in the Israelite and the Judean tradition. His conclusion, which I think others would share in broad terms, is that Jeremiah is an outsider priest. He isn't part of the internal Jerusalem cultic establishment, right? So his genealogy and otherwise, and from being from Matarot, he's an outsider. Whereas Ezekiel is an insider, and he's really connected to the temple establishment. So I do think both are priests, but both don't have the same access. My suspicion is that Habakkuk, who we can't know much about because there's no data, I think from the content of the materials, has a powerful concern with the cult and with the temple. This was a hypothesis developed by German scholars some decades ago about cult prophecy, and that he was a cult prophet. Allowing for certain changes given on development of our theories over time, I think Sigmund Mowinckel, who made that claim, I think is onto something that's still very important. So I would locate all of them in broadly speaking temple or priest contexts, and with access to the traditions in some way. And so here I'm also agreeing a little bit with Karl van der Toorn in his work on scribalism. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that would also fit the Jeremiah 29 advice that he gives the people, right? The use of Darash.
Yeah.
Right. So that would fit with that.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's not an accidental. I don't think it means simply, there's a pairing, there's Darash and the Tipalu, right? So the to pray, make inquiry, supplication. And I think those two things are concrete things he's asking them to do, not just in a general way, when you go to bed, you should say, now I lay me down to sleep. You should be engaged in active solicitation on behalf of the city.
And then we'll just press that a step further. So who would they be seeking in the context of Babylon?
If you can solve that one, write it up quick. We don't know anything about religious habits of the Judeans in Babylonia, even now with more data that the Al-Yahudu texts and so forth don't give us. They're not going to the synagogue, so we don't have that kind of background. So the question is, are they appealing to the God of Israel on behalf of Nebuchadnezzar, or are they learning to appeal to the gods of Babylonia? My suspicion is it's probably the first, and this is the Ezekiel 11 passage about God being Mikdash Ma'at. He's the small or temporary sanctuary or something like that, making inquiries possible. So I think that's what's going on.
Anything from the, all right, great, thank you.
Thank you very much.
And thank you everyone at home. You're all welcome to stay for more food and drink.
Thanks a lot. Thank you.